In this video, we're going to talk about the ventricular system of the brain. We're going to go over the different structures that make up this system along with their anatomy and function. We're also going to talk about cerebrospinal fluid or CSF, how it's produced, and how it flows throughout the system. We're going to wrap up this video with the simple trick to remember all the different structures, along with the order in which CSF circulates through those structures. So make sure to stay tuned until the end of the video. The first thing we have to do is ask ourselves, what is the ventricular system? The ventricular system is a network of communicating cavities within the brain. The main structures that make up this system are highlighted in the images. These cavities are known as ventricles, and there are a total of 4 ventricles we're going to be talking about. There are 2 lateral ventricles, a 3rd ventricle, and a 4th ventricle. And the function of these ventricles is to produce, circulate, and reabsorb cerebrospinal fluid throughout the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord. Now, we said the ventricles communicate with each other, so let's take a closer look at how they're all connected. We're looking at a lateral side view with the ventricles shown deep within the brain. We first have 2 lateral ventricles, which are a pair of C-shaped cavities, one located in each cerebral hemisphere. So the left lateral ventricle is located in the left cerebral hemisphere, and the right lateral ventricle is located in the right cerebral hemisphere. These ventricles are the largest in the system, and each lateral ventricle has a hole on the bottom of it known as a foramen. Together they're known as interventricular foramina, and they create a passageway that connects the 2 lateral ventricles to the 3rd ventricle. The 3rd ventricle sits deep within the midline of the brain in the diencephalon, right in between the 2 thalami and hypothalami. Just like we had a passageway that connected the 2 lateral ventricles to the 3rd ventricle, we also have a passageway that connects the 3rd ventricle to the 4th ventricle, and this passageway is known as the cerebral aqueduct. The 4th ventricle is located between the brainstem and cerebellum, and it narrows caudally to form the central canal of the spinal cord. Let's now take a look at these structures without the brain. You can use the label diagram next to it as a reference. Again, we have the 2 lateral ventricles, and on the bottom of each lateral ventricle is a passageway known as the interventricular foramen. They're also known as the foramina of Monro. The interventricular foramina connect each lateral ventricle to the 3rd ventricle. Through the cerebral aqueduct, the 3rd ventricle connects to the 4th ventricle, and the 4th ventricle narrows caudally to form and connect with the central canal of the spinal cord. Now that we have a good understanding of what the ventricles look like from the side, let's view them from a coronal or frontal section. In order to get this view, we're going to take a knife and cut the brain, remove the front portion, and then spin the brain so we're looking directly on where we just made the cut. You can use the images in the bottom left as a reference. Now, we said earlier the ventricles are cavities, so that's what we're going to be looking for here. And you'll first notice a pair of cavities right next to each other. They're fairly symmetrical and they're triangular in shape in this particular section. Now, there was only one pair of ventricles we talked about, and they were the lateral ventricles. And that's exactly what these are. These are those C-shaped lateral ventricles. Now we're just looking at them straight on. Next, you'll notice another cavity below the 2 lateral ventricles. This is the 3rd ventricle. It's a slit-like cavity deep within the midline of the brain in the diencephalon. And remember that each lateral ventricle connects to the 3rd ventricle through the interventricular foramen, which we're just going to draw in here so you can visualize it. Now that we can picture the ventricular system, each ventricle has some important features to know, so let's talk about some of those, starting with the lateral ventricles. As we mentioned before, they're a pair of C-shaped cavities. There's one located in each cerebral hemisphere, and they're the largest cavities of the ventricular system. Each lateral ventricle can be divided into different segments. The central portion is known as the body, and it's primarily located in the parietal lobe. And then coming off of the body are 3 different extensions or horns. The first one is the anterior horn or the frontal horn. As the name suggests, it's going to project anteriorly off of the body and extend into the frontal lobe. The next one is the posterior horn or the occipital horn. Same thing as the name suggests, it's going to project posteriorly off of the body into the occipital lobe. The next one is the inferior horn or the temporal horn. It's going to project inferiorly off the body and extend into the temporal lobe. The portion of the body that becomes continuous with the posterior and inferior horns has a special name. It's triangular in shape and it's known as the atrium or trigone. So the body becomes continuous with the posterior and inferior horns at the location of the atrium, and then the body becomes continuous with the anterior horn at the location of the interventricular foramen. And this brings us to our last feature. Each lateral ventricle has a passageway on the bottom of it known as the interventricular foramen. And this is going to be the passageway that connects the lateral ventricles to the 3rd ventricle. The interventricular foramen is also known as the foramen of Monro, and the fornix borders it anteriorly, and the thalamus borders it posteriorly. Now, we said earlier that the ventricles are cavities. In order to form a cavity, we need structures around it that create the boundaries. The lateral ventricles have a roof, a medial wall, and a floor, which also becomes the lateral wall. Generally speaking, the roof of the top of the C is going to be formed by the corpus callosum. Remember, the corpus callosum is what connects the right and left cerebral hemispheres and allows them to communicate with each other. And this is going to form the roof of the anterior horn, the body, and the posterior horn. The floor of the top of the C is formed by the caudate and thalamus, depending on which section we're looking at. We're going to see more of that here shortly. You can also see how these structures, particularly the caudate, is going to form the roof of the inferior horn. The floor of the inferior horn is primarily formed by the hippocampus and its associated structures. Let's now take a look at a frontal view where it's going to be easier to visualize all these boundaries, and we can also see the medial wall. So again, we have the pair of lateral ventricles like we saw before. Now we're going to look at the roof, the floor, and the medial wall. The roof is formed by the corpus callosum, and you can see how the corpus callosum is connecting the right and left cerebral hemispheres. The floor is bound by a couple structures. Laterally, it's formed by the caudate nucleus, and medially, it's formed by the thalamus. The medial wall is formed by the septum pellucidum, which is a thin membrane running from the corpus callosum down to the fornix, and it helps divide the anterior horns of the right and left lateral ventricles. Now, depending on which part of the lateral ventricle we're looking at, different parts of the septum pellucidum, fornix, caudate nucleus, and thalamus are going to be coming into play. So let's look at one more image that's going to help bring all of this together and make sense. Now we're looking at the brain from a sagittal view, and we can first see the corpus callosum, which is connecting the right and left cerebral hemispheres. We can also better visualize the fornix, and we can see the septum pellucidum, which is a thin membrane that runs from the corpus callosum down to the fornix. And each lateral ventricle is located below the corpus callosum on either side of the septum pellucidum. So now we can see as we move from the front to the back of the lateral ventricle, the medial wall changes. If we make a slice through the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, the medial wall is primarily formed by the septum pellucidum. If we make a slice through the body of the lateral ventricle, we can now see that part of the fornix is forming the medial wall in addition to the septum pellucidum. And then if we make a cut through the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle, we can see that the medial wall is primarily formed by the corpus callosum, specifically the forceps major, which is a bundle of fibers from the back of the corpus callosum that form the bulb. We can also see changes to the floor of the lateral ventricles as we move from the front to the back. So this is a very basic picture just to help visualize it, but again we have the corpus callosum and the fornix shown. Remember that the floor of the lateral ventricle is formed by the thalamus and the caudate nucleus. So we can overlay the lateral ventricle again, and it's transparent because remember it's going to be deep on the other side of the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. Use that image on the bottom right to refresh your memory. And we can see that the floor is going to change as we move from the front to the back of the lateral ventricle. So if we make a slice through the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, we can see that the floor is primarily formed by the head of the caudate nucleus. Whereas if we move back and make a slice through the body of the lateral ventricle, you can now see that the thalamus comes into play. So now the floor of the lateral ventricle is being formed by the body of the caudate nucleus as well as the thalamus. Here are a couple 3D models to help visualize this. So if we look at the image on the left, we can see the lateral ventricle shown in gray. We can also see the caudate nucleus. It's shaped like a C and it follows the shape of the lateral ventricle closely. And the caudate nucleus has a head in the front, a body in the middle, and a tail at the bottom. And now we can see that the floor of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle is formed by the head of the caudate nucleus. And as we move back to the body of the lateral ventricle, the floor is going to be formed by the body of the caudate nucleus. It's also going to be formed by the thalamus. And as we follow the caudate nucleus down to the tail, we can see that the tail actually forms part of the roof of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. We can also see how part of the floor of the inferior horn is formed by the hippocampus. The inferior horn is fairly flat, so the roof of the inferior horn turns into the lateral wall where the tapetum of the corpus callosum is, and the floor of the inferior horn turns into the medial wall. Now everything is labeled for you on the diagram on the right, so feel free to hit pause in the video and look at the relationship between the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. Now we focused on the main structures that form the boundaries of the lateral ventricles. If you want more detail on some of the smaller structures, feel free to check out the EasyMed blog that correlates with this video. It'll be linked down below in the description. Let's now move on to the third ventricle. The third ventricle is a slit-like cavity deep in the midline of the brain in the diencephalon, specifically between the right and left thalamus and hypothalamus. The third ventricle communicates with each lateral ventricle through the interventricular foramen, also known as the foramen of Monro. And the third ventricle communicates with the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct. This is also known as the Sylvian aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius. In some individuals, there's a mass of gray matter that travels through the third ventricle known as the interthalamic adhesion, and this connects the right thalamus with the left thalamus on the other side and vice versa. The third ventricle has 5 main recesses. In order to get a better view, we're going to zoom in on the ventricle and take a closer look. The first recess is the infundibular recess. It's located on the floor of the ventricle below the optic chiasm. It protrudes inferiorly into the infundibulum or the pituitary stalk. The pituitary gland is located just below the third ventricle, and the pituitary stalk or infundibulum connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus above it, and that infundibular recess protrudes right into that stalk. We're going to see a good image of this next, so if you can't picture it now, don't worry about it. We're just going to go through the 5 recesses, and then we'll bring it all together. The second recess is the supraoptic recess. It's located off the anterior aspect of the third ventricle, above the infundibular recess. It's also above the optic chiasm shown by the second star and below the lamina terminalis. The third recess is the anterior recess. It's located on the anterior superior aspect of the ventricle. It's also known as the vulva or the bulb of the ventricle. It's actually formed by the 2 interventricular foramina coming into the third ventricle laterally on each side. The next recess is the pineal recess. It's located on the posterior aspect of the third ventricle, and it protrudes posteriorly into the stalk of the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is located posterior to the third ventricle where that star is. The final recess is the suprapineal recess. As the name suggests, it's going to be located above the pineal recess in the superior posterior aspect of the third ventricle. Let's now take a look at what these recesses look like in a sagittal view of the brain. Just as a refresher, we've got the corpus callosum, the fornix, the lateral ventricles are located on either side. Below that is the third ventricle, and then the cerebral aqueduct connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. So starting with the infundibular recess, we can see it located on the floor of the third ventricle, and it protrudes inferiorly into the infundibulum or the pituitary stalk of the pituitary gland. And then just above that, we can see the supraoptic recess. As the name suggests, it's going to be located above the optic chiasm. Next, we have the anterior recess, and again, this is formed from the 2 interventricular foramina entering the third ventricle on either side. Next, we have the pineal recess. This is going to protrude posteriorly into the stalk of the pineal gland, which is located right there behind the third ventricle. Lastly, we have the suprapineal recess, and this is located above the pineal recess. Similar to how there were structures that form the boundaries of the lateral ventricles, there are also structures that form the boundaries of the third ventricle. The third ventricle has a roof, a floor, an anterior wall, a posterior wall, and 2 lateral walls. The roof extends from the interventricular foramina anteriorly to the suprapineal recess posteriorly, and the floor extends from the optic chiasm anteriorly to the cerebral aqueduct posteriorly. This means that the anterior wall is going to extend from the interventricular foramina superiorly down to the optic chiasm inferiorly, and the posterior wall extends from the suprapineal recess superiorly down to the cerebral aqueduct inferiorly. Let's now take a look at what structures form these 4 walls using a sagittal view of the brain. You may have noticed that it's very difficult to find a simple resource or image that clearly outlines the structures that make up the walls of the third ventricle. So I've done that for you by color coding these structures. I've also numbered them for anybody who's colorblind, so hopefully this will make the boundaries of the third ventricle easy. We're going to start with the roof, and again the roof extends from the interventricular foramina anteriorly to the suprapineal recess posteriorly. The first structure you're going to notice is the fornix. That's going to make up part of the roof. The rest of the roof is formed by the telechoroidea or the choroid plexus. This is going to produce the cerebrospinal fluid, and we'll be talking more about that shortly. And then located above the telechoroidea is the fornix and the hippocampal commissure. As we move to the anterior wall, this is going to extend from the interventricular foramina down to the optic chiasm. The main structures that form the anterior wall, moving from superior to inferior, include the anterior columns of the fornix, and this is going to make up the superior lateral margin, and then the anterior commissure crosses the anterior wall at its upper end. The rest of the anterior wall is formed by the lamina terminalis, a thin sheet of pia and gray matter that runs from the optic chiasm up to the rostrum of the corpus callosum, passing the anterior commissure. Remember that the supraoptic recess, which is located above the optic chiasm, is also going to be located in the anterior wall. As we move on to the floor, this is going to extend from the optic chiasm anteriorly to the cerebral aqueduct posteriorly. The main structures that make up the floor going from an anterior to posterior direction include the optic chiasm, infundibulum, tuber cinereum, mammillary bodies, posterior perforated substance, and the tegmentum of the midbrain. Also remember that the infundibular recess is going to be located in the floor of the third ventricle as well. The infundibular recess protrudes inferiorly into the pituitary stalk or the infundibulum, and this connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. The posterior wall extends from the suprapineal recess superiorly to the cerebral aqueduct inferiorly. And the main structures that make up the posterior wall going from a superior to inferior direction include the habenular commissure, the pineal gland, and the posterior commissure. Remember that the pineal recess is also located in the posterior wall, and it protrudes into the pineal stalk of the pineal gland. Now the only two walls left that we haven't talked about are the lateral walls. In order to get a better view of this, we're going to look at a frontal or coronal section. Again, the third ventricle is located in the midline of the brain below the two lateral ventricles. The lateral walls of the third ventricle are formed by the thalamus and hypothalamus. So the right thalamus and hypothalamus form the right lateral wall of the third ventricle, and the left thalamus and left hypothalamus form the left lateral wall of the third ventricle. In this particular frontal section, we can see a good view of the two thalami that form the lateral walls. In order to see the hypothalamus, let's look at another sagittal view. We've got our third ventricle highlighted in red here. And the lateral wall of the third ventricle can be divided into a superior section and an inferior section. The superior portion is formed by the thalamus, and the inferior portion is formed by the hypothalamus. It's the hypothalamic sulcus that divides the thalamus from the hypothalamus, or in other words, it divides the superior portion from the inferior portion of the lateral wall of the third ventricle. Let's now move on to the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle is a tent-shaped structure located between the brainstem and cerebellum, with the brainstem located anteriorly and the cerebellum located posteriorly. Again, the cerebral aqueduct connects the third and fourth ventricles, and the cerebral aqueduct is the narrowest portion of the ventricular system. And for that reason, it's the most common location for a blockage to occur. This can cause a condition known as hydrocephalus, where cerebrospinal fluid accumulates. The fourth ventricle narrows caudally to form and connect with the central canal of the spinal cord, and this particular location where it narrows is known as the obex. Like we said earlier, the fourth ventricle is shaped like a tent. The apex of the tent is known as the fastigium. Now the fourth ventricle has the ability to communicate with the subarachnoid space, and it does so through a number of apertures. The first two apertures are the lateral apertures, also known as the foramen of Luschka, and this allows the fourth ventricle to communicate with the cerebellopontine angle. The other aperture is the median aperture, also known as the foramen of Magendie, and this allows the fourth ventricle to communicate with the cisterna magna or the cerebellomedullary cistern. Now we're going to see a better image of the median aperture here shortly, but you can see how the lateral apertures come off of the lateral aspect of the fourth ventricle. And these lateral apertures are actually formed by two of the 5 recesses that the fourth ventricle has. So here we have a basic cartoon image of the fourth ventricle. You can see if you look at it from the side, we'll have that tent-like structure that we're used to seeing. And if you look at it from above, you'll see more of a starfish shape. There are 5 main recesses, and they include 2 lateral recesses, and these form the 2 lateral apertures, also known as the foramen of Luschka. There's 1 median dorsal recess, and located on either side of that are 2 lateral dorsal recesses. The median dorsal recess and the 2 lateral dorsal recesses extend posteriorly into the cerebellum. Now, just like we saw with the lateral ventricles in the third ventricle, there are specific structures that form the boundaries of the fourth ventricle. First, you can see a better image of the median aperture opening up into the subarachnoid space. So the boundaries of the fourth ventricle include a floor, which is the anterior part, the roof, which is the posterior part, and 2 lateral walls. Starting with the floor, this is going to be formed primarily by the brainstem, specifically the pons and the superior portion of the medulla. The roof of the fourth ventricle is shaped like a tent, and the apex of the tent, also known as the fastigium, divides the roof into a superior part and an inferior part. The superior part of the roof is formed by the superior cerebellar peduncles, along with a thin layer of tissue between these peduncles, known as the superior medullary vellum. The inferior part of the roof is formed by the inferior medullary vellum, along with the tela choroidea. The tela choroidea gives rise to the choroid plexus, which produces the CSF. We're going to talk about that shortly. This membrane extends laterally and joins with the inferior cerebellar peduncles. And then the median aperture, also known as the foramen of Magendie, is located at the bottom part of the inferior roof, and it opens up into the subarachnoid space. To get a better view of the lateral walls, we're going to look down into the floor of the fourth ventricle. So we've taken the cerebellum and removed it, and now we're looking at that diamond-shaped floor of the fourth ventricle. It's called the rhomboid fossa for that reason. Now we know from before that the floor of the fourth ventricle is formed by the pons and the medulla. So if we draw a line through the floor of the fourth ventricle, we're going to have the pons above it and the medulla below it. The lateral walls of the fourth ventricle can be divided into a superior portion and an inferior portion. The superior part is formed by the superior cerebellar peduncles. whereas the inferior part is formed by the inferior cerebellar peduncles along with the cuneate and gracile tubercles. And then remember, coming off of the lateral walls are the two lateral recesses that open up into the subarachnoid space as the lateral apertures, also known as the foramen of Luschka. Let's wrap this up by talking about cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. Like we said at the beginning of the video, the function of the ventricles is to produce, circulate, and reabsorb CSF throughout the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord. So we've got another sagittal view here, and just to refresh our memory, we've got the lateral ventricle, interventricular foramen, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, and fourth ventricle. The walls of the ventricles are lined by ependymal cells, and there are certain regions within each ventricle that are lined by a double layer of pia mater and are highly vascularized. These are known as the tela choroidea. And the tela choroidea has protrusions that project into the ventricles, and they're lined by specialized ependymal cells. This is known as the choroid plexus, and it produces most of the CSF. The choroid plexus is filled with a network of capillaries, and the CSF is produced by filtering the plasma out of those capillaries and through the specialized ependymal cells that line the plexus. All four ventricles have a choroid plexus. You can see in the image on the left that the choroid plexus lining is shown in green as indicated by the red stars. We can see that there's a choroid plexus in the lateral ventricle, and this actually extends down through the interventricular foramen and forms the roof of the third ventricle. There's also a choroid plexus located on the inferior part of the roof of the fourth ventricle. The only locations without a choroid plexus are the anterior and posterior horns of the lateral ventricles and the cerebral aqueduct. Each choroid plexus has the ability to produce CSF, but most of the CSF is produced by the choroid plexus in the lateral ventricles. As the CSF is produced in the lateral ventricles, it's going to travel through the interventricular foramen and enter the third ventricle. The CSF will then exit the third ventricle and travel through the cerebral aqueduct and enter the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, the CSF can enter the subarachnoid space either through the lateral apertures, also known as the foramen of Luschka, or the median aperture, also known as the foramen of Magendie. The CSF can also enter the central canal of the spinal cord. Now the CSF that entered the subarachnoid space will continue to travel through that space surrounding both the brain and spinal cord. Now the CSF has multiple different functions. You can see that the CSF-filled ventricles, along with the CSF that surrounds the brain and spinal cord, allow the brain to float or become buoyant in the cranium, and this actually reduces the weight of both the brain and spinal cord. The CSF also acts as a cushion to lubricate and protect the brain and spinal cord. The CSF also provides a stable chemical environment for the brain. And lastly, the CSF provides nutrients for the central nervous system while also removing metabolic waste from the central nervous system as it gets reabsorbed back into the vasculature. Now, how does the CSF get reabsorbed back into the vasculature? It does so through arachnoid granulations, which are protrusions that project into the dural venous sinuses. We're going to take a closer look at that now. We can see the three meningeal layers that surround the brain. We have the dura mater on the outside, the arachnoid mater, which is the middle layer, and the pia mater, which is the innermost layer that surrounds the brain. There's going to be a different EasyMed video that talks about the meningeal layers, so don't worry about those right now. The space that matters to us is what's between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. This is the subarachnoid space, and it's where the CSF is traveling through. We can see that there's a projection coming off of the subarachnoid space. These are known as arachnoid granulations, and they project into the dural venous sinuses. The dural venous sinuses are spaces between the periosteal and meningeal layers of the dura mater. They're basically collecting pools of venous blood that drain the central nervous system, and all of the dural venous sinuses ultimately drain into the internal jugular vein. So in this particular image, we can see the arachnoid granulation projecting through the dura mater and into the superior sagittal sinus. And this arachnoid granulation will allow the CSF to drain from the subarachnoid space into the venous system. Here are a couple more pictures of those arachnoid granulations that are going to drain the CSF from the subarachnoid space into the dural venous sinuses of the venous system. There's going to be a separate EasyMed video that talks about the anatomy of the dural venous sinuses, so don't worry about those right now. Just know that that's where the CSF is going to be drained into. Let's wrap this up with a simple mnemonic that will help you remember all the structures of the ventricular system, as well as the order in which the CSF circulates through those structures. The mnemonic to remember here is liquid inside the cerebrum flows around subarachnoid space. This will help you remember that the CSF travels from the lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramina into the third ventricle, through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. It leaves the fourth ventricle through the apertures and enters the subarachnoid space, and ultimately gets drained into the sinuses. This mnemonic is good for 3 reasons. It will help you remember the names of the structures. It will also help you remember the order in which CSF travels through those structures, and also the words in the mnemonic. Liquid inside the cerebrum flows around subarachnoid space. This will help you remember that the CSF inside the ventricles ultimately flow into the subarachnoid space.